It's going to be a little bit of a difficult act to follow with what Chris and Nathan were talking around, and there's a lot of crossover with what I do. But I'm going to approach this from a very different angle, and as one of the people who actually create this stuff for film and television. And I've got to admit, this is one of the most feared talks I've ever had to do, because generally I'm talking to Photoshop artists or After Effects artists and motion graphics people. And it's the first time I've actually had to do it in front of a group of UI, UX professionals. And so it feels like I'm lining up for my execution here. So, I mean, generally, it's very hard to describe what I do. And I dread social functions, because the first question you always get after somebody, you've introduced your name, is, anybody? What do you do? You know? It's never, what do you like, or who is your favorite Muppet? It's always like, what do you do? And I struggle to do this, so even my mother has no idea what I actually do. And when I actually worked out a way in the end to try and describe what it is, and it's essentially, I'll just say, well, when people are using computers and they're tapping away and there's like a couple of beeps and, and those little mouse clicks, and all of a sudden it just flashes up on screen, and you see this one thing. And I said, oh, yeah, somebody does that? Why would they do that? But of course, people know the other version of this as well, which is more like, And the two cliches that are used a hell of a lot, but there's very good reasons for their existence in films. And what I'll do is I'm going to explore some of the work that I've done here, and then actually set it in context, and set it in the context that you'll recognize based on you doing proper UX work, as far as you have requirements, stakeholders, and design process, and delivery. You actually have to deliver a job. So, but to kind of play into this and show you some of my background, what I'll do is I'll play my last showreel that I created that has a collage of some of the work that I've done over the years. Can we cut the lights down a little, or? Now that's kind of a little collection of some of the film I've done over a period of about 12 years. And it is, as one friend described, as beautiful junk. So, and it's always something we've always really struggled to define what you actually call this stuff. You know, it's like, is it screen graphics or is it screen interfaces, or there's no real good term for it. And a couple of years ago, I started using one particular term, and it seems to have kind of stuck. And of course, everybody's familiar with the idea of GUIs, so what we actually create are FUIs. And it's generally referred to as fantasy user interfaces, and it's kind of started to stick now. And when you mention the word FUI, people actually think you're not actually insulting them or something. So, but the one thing that, and the great criticisms that keep coming up about a lot of this stuff and how we actually do it is it really just about looks? And there is probably no such group such as yourselves, other than maybe /forum members, who watch this stuff with like such a critical eye. But without context to something and understanding some of the decisions that are made around something, that eye can be really easily deceived. Because despite the kind of gaudiness and general unreality of a lot of the FUIs that we get created for movies and TV, there's really good reasons for why they look the way they do. And despite some of the similarity of purpose that visually FUI has to GUI work and interface design work, and there are actually massively different requirements, and it's the requirements that define how this stuff looks and works. And irrespective of how insane it can sometimes look, compared to the real world, it's only once you know those things you can start to get a grip on them. So what are those things? So there is essentially three major requirements for anything. So one of them is style. So why it has to look a certain way for a certain reason. The next one is action. It's got to do something, and it's got to specifically apply in some way within the context of the film. And then, unfortunately, the third requirement is what I call X factor. So these are the kind of hard to define factors that you get into anything. So I'm going to look at each one of these things and go through some of the ways I've applied it within my work, and also a couple of small examples from other people's as well. So when it comes to style requirements, so why do they look the way they do? And so and it all depends. And this requirement comes from the nature of the film. So is it realistic? Is it a sci-fi film? Is it realistic, but kind of a little bit quirky, like, say, Mission Impossible, where the actual base part of it is very non-real. Mission Impossible doesn't exist, so you can kind of push these things a little bit. So the first is just realistic, and most of the time you don't even see these interfaces in films. They actually melt away. You're so used to seeing this day in, day out, that you just don't spot them at all. And a couple of examples of this, and as soon as I show them though, you're going to be going, well, that's not very realistic here. So even though when you do realistic, there's a couple of things that you have to alter and change. So I generally don't use anything that looks like OS X or Windows. And there's very good logistical and technical reasons for doing that. There's also diplomatic reasons. So they would love their stuff to be in films, unless it's the baddie. And if the baddie's got it, they don't want it. They don't want their products represented like that. And plus, they want to approve all the changes and everything else, so it's very hard to use realistic. So what I tend to do with a lot of this design is actually almost look towards more things like GNOME and open source systems like Linux, and skin these systems so they have the cues, all the design cues are there, all the buttons look like they work, all the iconography looks similar. And some of this stuff is actually sourced from open source libraries that get used in real software. So it looks familiar. There's nothing about that that could look kind of funky. The thing that is unrealistic about realistic screens, shall I say, is that we tend to speed it up. We make it look like it's doing something, and make it look like it's doing something really, really fast. Because unfortunately, if you have a database on your system and you type a search term in, nothing happens. It waits. It's searching. But in the film, you're having to tell this is what they're doing, so you have to call it out somehow. You have to like put a progress bar up that zips along multiple times or whatever. So you just have to make it look like there's a lot more going on than there really is. You know. So, but a lot of the time you just don't see it. But I've even tried with realistic to actually. We once had to do a set of 150 computers for an office scene, and we just tried to put this up on every single screen. And in the end, we got away with half of them. So, So the next type is what I also call realistic. But this is where you can push it a little bit. It's still set in real recognizable worlds. It's in our time period. It's normal people doing normal things, but the machines might be more sophisticated. So, an example of this, like from Deja Vu, it is a current day plot. It's a current day circumstance, I say. But the plot, it involves time travel. It involves looking through time. So the technology they have has to look different. It's got to feel like there's something special and different about it. Now, the previous screen that I showed you was also from Deja Vu, but it was from a very different scene and a very different area in that movie, which was actually part of a forensics lab, which is just part of regular FBI, or the ATF, sorry, was in the movie. But that has to look genuine and real. But in this section of the film, you have to convey that actually these guys have got something better. This is way more sophisticated. So you use essentially a lot of similar visual cues, with buttons and things like that. But it looks more polished in some ways. Design-wise, it looks like it's been thought about and laid out a little bit more. And it's the same across the whole system. We actually create an OS for this kind of thing. So even for full screen work, all these elements are actually reused and retasked across whole sort of areas. So this was actually in the original reel, right at the beginning of the big wall screen. This was across that entire thing. But there's also areas in the sort of realistic stuff which, at first glance, you think, well, this is completely unreal. Screens done for children and men. Now, this is where areas where you start to get into futurism. And I love doing futurism, but there's going to be a whole lot of people who probably throw shoes at me or something if I say it. But it's generally not that difficult a job, because most stuff evolves. It doesn't change radically. Things change very slowly over time. I mean, OS X looks wonderful now. It's still a window, and there's a mouse, and there's buttons that close that window, and there's icons in there, and there's folders. And 30 years on, it's exactly the same. It just looks better in some ways. And there's a whole many more refinements to it than that. Obviously, I'm simplifying it. But things evolve. They become slicker. And even though for this particular film it was set in 2027, technology froze in 2010. So the idea was to use almost like a Windows 7 type look and feel to stuff. And even the spreadsheet is based on Excel, which was a prototype. I think they beat it at the time. This was 2 years before it came out. But you use those kind of cues from that kind of thing to make it look like it's set in a realistic period of time. But oddly enough, in realistic stuff, it can go horribly wrong as well. So, this particular screen was done for Mission Impossible. In fact, the entire Mission Impossible complex has this interface on it. And did some really nice, sophisticated design work for it, and actually based it all off like military devices. So military devices tend to be one task. They're set up to do one thing, low color, very, very basic. And it just didn't quite fit into the sort of look and feel that the director was wanting with his film. And he had these reference photos and said, this is what we want it to look like. And they were actually from the CIA, and there were some CIA systems. And it was IRIX from about 94, 93, yeah. So I thought, yeah, that's what you want, that's what you get, you know. And it is kind of altered a little bit to just freshen, you know, just keep it something a bit more punch in there. But then talking later with the military advisor, which seems to be complementary with every single film they do these days, he looked at the photos and laughed and said, yeah, they're 15 years old. He said, that's the clearance time on a lot of this stuff. You know, so, you know, instead of having the current day system, which is generally looks pretty much the same as what we use, you know, it's actually, you know, a lot older. But also in realistic as well, of course, you know, we're now used to having devices that operate as applications. You know, so even an interface for something like the island, which was like a communication device, which is displayed on a piece of glass, and even though it's sci-fi, you know, we can actually still use some of the same cues. So I'd actually class this as a realistic type of thing. You know. The third area of style is what we affectionately call fluff. And you have a free range to do this kind of work. But the real irony here is this is the hardest stuff to do. You still have to use a lot of design cues from the real world and yet create something radical and different, you know. And that can be really, really hard to do because generally anybody who works in design knows that the tighter the limitations on what you can do really kind of pushes you to do something really good. Yeah. But with this kind of area, you know, you can do almost anything you want. Yeah. So, you know, for this kind of thing, for Mr. and Mrs. Smith, it was taking, like I said, the military devices, and these were some of the design cues I used for the Mission Impossible originally. But everything can get used again somewhere. Yeah. So. The next one is actually the concept for Mission Impossible originally. So this is what it was supposed to look like. Yeah. So it's building upon existing devices and the way they look and work, and even keeping cues like using old LED fonts. And one of the tasks you actually have to do is recreate a lot of this stuff and actually make your own fonts. Yeah. But to keep the little design cues like that, to give the impression of this is a device that does one thing and one thing only, and then, you know, and populate this, you know, the set for that kind of thing. But you know, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But everything gets reused. You know, so this formed the cornerstone of a lot of concept work I did for Call of Duty, one of the games. So all the cut screens that were done in there are based on the same sort of thing. So it's good to recycle. And then another example, even though it's fantastical, you know, it was actually a medical device used in the island. But this was actually taking cues from things like audio instrumentation. So a lot of audio software has this thing about reproducing the physical device to be used. So we took it in a medical context. People have medical devices they use. Why not do a similar thing? Because they're using it on a screen rather than, you know, rather than having some abstract kind of device. You know, they can just use the almost identical device, you know, on a display. And even though this is still fluff, I mean, it's like it tells a little bit of the story. They're looking at this guy. The part of the story is they're going to remove his liver. And you know, you see this up on screen, and it focuses that target on there. And this actually shows another little point here with the next screen, because this other one is also from the island. And each screen is specifically tailored for its environment. So the screens themselves and the FUIs actually are tailored to particular sets, and they can actually be used almost as characters. You know, these are defining looks to different things. So from the very same film, even though this is a medical area, you know, there's a group of mercenaries, and their whole interface is very radically different. But you'll use that consistent, you know, sort of look and feel for everything that they have. So it also allows people to visually separate. So if you use the same system on everything, it all kind of blurs together. So it allows us to actually make things stand apart. Yeah. So the second big area of requirements is actually what we call the action requirements. And what does this stuff actually have to do? So the first part of this is, at its most basic, it's just set dressing. Everything has got to populate a set. Everything that is on a set, there's a decision about why that stuff is there, how it looks and how it's going to work. And an example from the previous thing we talked about, the island, is just, this was shot just when the set was empty and everybody was at lunch. But it's just to make this thing look like a control room. So the vast majority of this stuff, you never really see up close. And it really just makes this place and gives it a certain sort of look and feel. The second requirement within actions is what we call location linking. And this is where you start to really use screens to some good effect in movies. So you have something going on in one place. You have something going on in another place. And to just imply that from an edit in the movie can be very, very difficult. So you'll always notice that they're either on a phone or they're talking to something, and the two people are always doing the similar things. But even if they're cutting back and forth, you can see these two are doing something with each other. And that's a lot of the time this actually gets used as well in films. So people will be at a terminal, they'll be looking into another place. This particular example was from Mission Impossible 3. It's got that lovely interface again. Another example from XXX2, I think it was. So some people are somewhere in a control room, they're talking to the guy who's on a train, and it's continually cutting between these two things. And I think in the end cut, this actually was cut completely. I think it's not even in the final cut. And so they're giving instructions back and forth, but you get big red letters, that's what we need. But it tells you what is going on. So just using pure film and pure visual effects doesn't always do it. Sometimes they want to call this out and smack you around the head with it to actually tell you what's happening. And one of my favorite examples of this is what I used to think until about half an hour ago was one of the earliest examples of screen graphics in films. and that was from Dr. Strangelove. And this is one of the best examples I've ever seen of location linking between two places. And there's only two real big scenes in this. There's the war room and there's the bomber. There's the base thing as well, but most of the action happens between these two places. And yet, all the time you are linked to them. You see that bomber is always on that screen, and it's always there. So you're connecting different things back together, and it's being used as a really powerful editorial device. So one of the third part of this is what we call story insight. And now, people do stuff in films. There's a story to tell. And sometimes it's kind of tricky to get across what is actually going on. So the people who now use visual effects, they'll try and do narrative, but it tends to get a little bit boring. It's like reading a Dan Brown book. It's like you have 15 pages about the history of this envelope that they found. And it just doesn't work. It will kill any film that you watch. So sometimes they will do this talk, but while they're doing it, they'll call out a specific piece of action, and they might even have a simulation on screen. So this was from Tomb Raider originally, and a lot of the action is going to happen because of all the planets aligning at certain parts, and they align in 3 different stages. So this was kind of done just as an illustration. So as they're talking to each other about what's happening, you get this idea that everything is lining up. As a visual device, it immediately just tells people very quickly, oh, this is happening, and gets the piece of wood and hits them over the head. But they get it. There's no abstraction there or anything, so it becomes a lot easier. Another area for this is for straight action. Something is going on. So this is where you specifically pull out and talk about a key part of the story, and the screens are used to illustrate that. And what I'll do here is I'll play the sequence, and what you're going to hear is the audio cut from the scene, which I take that audio cut and then I animate and create the sequence based on what is going on in that background using various sources of video and edits. So you can see and hear this.
Gentlemen, I understand there's been an incident.
Sir, Starkweather ran from the
So of course you're going to get cuts back and forth with the live action here as this goes on.
Do you find it funny? Play it back, please.
Oh, by the way, with those little sound effects that you hear, it turns out every editor has a CD that's been passed around with each other that has all these sound effects on them.
Stop.
And they've been doing it for almost 20 years. That's why every single film has the same sounds for computers.
Back it up at half speed.
So we'll use this just to specifically call out actions and synchronize it with a cut that's going on. So he's obviously not too happy about that.
On the loose. Get me a facial match.
So the next area, the last area of this is kind of what it doesn't kind of fit into any particular slot. And it's a very different application for it. And this is where you actually create either the way something, how something is looking at something, or heads-up displays. So it's the ways of looking into the film. And this is more of a visual effect than an interface, but it implies certain actions from it going on. This example here is from Alien vs. Predator. To use a lot of the design cues that were based from the original film, from the set dressing, from the design of the creatures and everything. And this is, this thing slides in and has an analysis thing on it. So it's doing something, it's looking at something, and it just keeps those cues in there. And it's not quite in the same category, but it's close. The other irony is that the specification I had for this in the final film, they forgot about the soundtrack down the left side, so it got slipped off completely. Another example from the island, which is things like scopes. This is like the wet dream of a sniper scope. And what do you want on there? What can you have on there? So. And another short example from the island, which was just the heads-up displays on the flying bikes. So these are just small things that you create as part of the product, that goes into the whole film. And then, of course, you get into what you might regard as the X factor. So if there's one particular problem we get designing stuff for film, what do you reckon it is? Anybody? People? People are the hardest part of anything. The stakeholders in a project are generally the most influential part of the project, but they also bring a lot of their own ideas with them as well. So what you have is all these groups of people on a set that want some input in some way. And they bring a lot of these preconceptions and expectations, and usually always at the last moment. This is the last thing they're thinking about in a movie or on a TV show. It's like, right, we're doing this, we're doing this, we're doing that. Oh, what's going on that screen? 2 minutes before shooting, usually, And they're not bad at what they do. These are fantastically creative and talented people doing very specific things. And it's the last thing that they want to think about. They're not good at thinking about that. It's the same as a CEO of any large company. They are not UX people. They're not designers. They're going to have to process it in a very different way. But of course, they're making decisions about what you're actually doing, which can be a real diplomatic tightrope to walk. And so it can be a lot easier sometimes for these people to actually use prior art in movies that they've already seen, or examples in the real world that they've already seen. And this is a real irony about Nathan and Chris's talk, is that it's probably reversed now. You know, we're no longer going from sci-fi influencing, in some cases, what is going on in the real world. Even though a lot of sci-fi reflected what those expectations and social contexts were. You know, they're literally going back to the DVD library and say, yeah, we want it like that. It's like, okay, you do something like, no, I want that. You know. So it can be very hard for this stuff to actually now progress and adapt and change. You know. But of course, they have one priority in all of this, and this really comes up to what defines the overarching requirement of all of this stuff, which is why it looks nothing like the real world and why it doesn't work anything like the real world. And that requirement is to tell the story. That is all it is there. You know, it doesn't matter what it looks like, how it works, it's just got to tell that story. And that's all that matters to the people making the movies. So if it hits those first 2 points in the major requirements about style and action and what it's going to do, that's it. They don't care. It's done what it's doing, get it out. And it's only, unfortunately, people like ourselves who look at this stuff a lot more critically and think, what the hell is that? You know? And it can be really easy to be really harsh on the artists who created this stuff. I mean, the CSI effect applies to more than just jury expectations in trials. You know, it can actually apply now to expectations about what computers can do. But those guys do incredible work. They're turning out a show every week, and a massive amount of work. And they're one thing. All they're doing is telling a little piece of the story using a screen. It's not an interface. It's not a computer. It's just a screen showing a piece of video, telling this is what happened. You know. And in that respect, they've done their job fantastically. You know. So, I mean, talking about that, what I'll do is I'll just play this one sequence from The Island. So it kind of encompasses a lot of those clips and expands on some from the reel. But thinking about how those requirements and context work, you can probably watch this in a very different way and actually get something back and see how this kind of works. Yeah. They love spinning heads in this film. But a lot of the time, I mean, things like the head thing, it gets reused a lot because you can also have very limited resources and media to use, so you kind of have to make do, you know. So that's really kind of ties up a lot of those pieces and how they go together. So you have action, you have things telling the story, you have things linking locations. So it was a really good example of how a lot of those different areas and how they're applied get used. But of course, there's one thing missing from that yet, and that is deployment. So everybody's got to deliver something, whether it's a piece of software, or it's a site, it's an application, whatever. But the way this is done might actually surprise you. We never, ever create an interactive application. That just doesn't exist. It is impossible to do in the time that we have. You may have 2 months to create 200 of these things. So you have to knock several of these things out every day. You cannot create interactive applications at that kind of rate. So what these are actually done, they're actually all faux animation in them. So they're all faux interactive. And everything's actually done in Photoshop and then actually animated in After Effects. But it's animated in a very, very particular way. So I will actually use my mouse and have a cursor, and I'll click here, click there, and I use the thing on screen. Then also think about the stages of this. It does this, and then it has to hold here and loop for a while, and then it goes into the next stage, and then holds for a while. And so I can create these cues for it. And all I actually render out is a single animation. And actually using graphics format, which I first used about 16 years ago, called just Graphics 256. So all of these things you see are all 256 color movies. So when we actually apply this stuff on set and move this stuff around, it's tiny. It's like a megabyte, it's 2 megabytes a movie. And a lot of those that you've seen are actually tiny movies. And so using this horrific old amazing piece of technology, but it's a usability nightmare, which was Debabelizer. And it's the most awful program to use, but extraordinarily powerful. So we use that for converting these movies down. And it's also not, as you probably imagine, you see the special shot and the extras on DVDs and movies of all these blue screens everywhere, and people will track these shots in after. It's very rare that you actually do that. And if you do that, there's a failure somewhere else, either to deliver the thing for it, or it requires footage that's being shot out of sequence. So what is required on there has not yet been shot. So generally, all of this stuff actually goes and gets played live on set. So everything looks and feels like it's actually working. All of these movies are up there, and we will queue them up, and we'll actually have our own separate control room and a special piece of software where we can synchronize these movies and just put keyframes on them. It's like, okay, from 0 to 50, loop. From 51 to 100, next in the sequence, then go into the next loop. So as take a single movie and then be able to cue it on action. But what you see on set there is just the monitors. All the boxes are empty because it is a nightmare for the sound guy. So he will beat us with that big long boom of his if we bring a computer anywhere near a set. So what we actually have is right underneath this is here. So these are some friends, and this is our setup. And it's actually a mirror of the set above us. And we also have feeds from little video cameras we put all over the set. We have feeds from the video assist, and we watch the action. So the actual actor, actress, cues, action, whatever's going on, we watch that, and then we do the interaction. We don't let them touch anything. Actors have to concentrate on, they're quite capable, I'm sure. It's just, they're concentrating on a performance, not using a computer. And that is going to take them out of it completely to do that. So we will be there, as my buddy Adrian is here, on a key, ready to watch this and then hit that key, next sequence. So it just looks like they did the action themselves. They can hit anything they want. But we made sure it was just that, and they didn't hit the button twice or do something stupid with it. But this is the kind of thing. So we'll load the movie up, set the range of keyframes in, and put it on some keys and functions. But quickly, is where does, I mean, these ideas come from? And this is like really where it ties back to what Chris and Nathan were talking about. And you know, how do you create this stuff? You know, and generally, you know, it doesn't exist, you know, in a bubble. You know, we don't just make this stuff up. You know, I look everywhere to the real world for a lot of influence and a lot of ideas and things I can use that inspire me for these things. And there's an odd irony here, is that this is the other way around. The Surface came out about 6 months after the Island, and strangely enough, the Island got credited for it. But of course, that's not true. You know, surface computing's been around 10 years before that. And you take a lot of these ideas from labs and universities and companies and garage projects that people are doing every day, but you kind of take it and then just make it look like it works. You take all those rough edges off it, you make it look casual almost, the way they do it. And really just make it sort of every day, you know. But I mean, these next couple of frames are something I lifted from a little short talk I did on copying. And it was the idea of how, you know, where does your influence come from? Why is copying a good thing rather than a bad thing? Or how do you copy well, you know? It was actually a talk called the inspiration loop. So, you know, you just do a straight copy of something, you end up exactly where you began. And it's not generally a good thing. But if you're inspired by something, you'll actually end up with something slightly different. You know, you take that one point and end up somewhere else. But of course, you have like multiple sources continuously, so you never do that. And you know, in real life, it's more like that. You know, so it's actually good to copy. You know, as far as I'm concerned, it's actually good to be inspired by real stuff. Somebody else has already made the mistakes. Stand on their shoulders and make it better. You know, and don't ever be afraid of doing that. You know, but as long as you make it better and don't just copy it. You know. But of course, it had to happen. But there's one shot I have in here that was exactly the same as the previous one. But I mean, all I really wanted to say is that don't be too harsh when you see this kind of stuff, because without the context of what this stuff is there for and what it is doing, especially when people go, that's the most unrealistic screen anybody's ever seen in a film, when it was actually real software. So it was called NView, and it ran on IRIX back in '93, and it was a 3D file browser. Yeah. So, but the script editor, that was a whole different thing. Yeah. So, but anyway, thank you. I hope that gave you some insight. So.
Thank you. There was actually one question on Twitter that I wanted to ask you, which is, and if you're willing to reveal any Easter eggs in your interface designs that we could hunt once we've left here.
There are actually. There's lots, but the problem, unfortunately, they won't mean much to anybody who is not somebody I know.
Okay.
Because one of the greatest problems you have is populating its content. So whenever, like, you had that lottery thing in the island, they're all people I know. So, you know, all the names and everything, and you know,
take it from your address book and
yeah,
right in there.
I get their permission, and I also, you know, a lot of you have mugshots, like CIA mugshots or whatever. You have to flick through a library. They're all people I met at conferences, various different places.
So maybe you can get him to take a picture of you, and you can be in his next film. Well, thank you very much, Mark.
Yeah.